Hi, everyone, and welcome to Evolving Compliance and Risk Management for Future Readiness, the Risk Minds webinar in partnership with Archer. My name is Afif Fakhreddin, the editor at Risk Minds, and I'll be your chair for today. Before we get started, I wanted to share some important information on how you can get the most out of today's webinar. So first of all, if you can please use the Q&A box to send in your questions, just type it in and click send. We'll try and cover as much of these as possible towards the end of the webinar. Additionally, if you missed anything or would like to share this webinar, you can download today's slide deck from the resources widget, and an archive of this webinar will be sent in 24 hours. Finally, if anything is amiss, type it into the Q&A box so we can help you resolve it. Without much further ado then, I'd like to welcome our presenter, Steve Schlorman, Integrated Risk Management Strategist at Archer, to discuss the role of risk and compliance in creating strategic advantage. Steve, the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you very much. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining me. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. Today, I want to talk about how compliance and risk management isn't just about avoiding pitfalls. It's really about creating advantage. Today's leaders are asking really critical questions of risk and compliance functions. Where should the business go? What risks are worth taking for a greater reward? And these are complex discussions where strong risk management, strong compliance processes can add real value if they are positioned to be a catalyst for growth and success rather than check the box exercises. So in this session, we'll explore how some different thinking can deliver some measurable benefits for your organizations. So I want to start off with the concept that risk management is an enterprise challenge that requires an enterprise solution. It seems intuitive, but so often we see organizations that are thinking about compliance, risk management, and different functions that help overcome obstacles or manage potential negative events in a siloed manner. But every risk is connected, whether it's a regulatory requirement that leads to some fine or violation, or it's a business disruption. Those types of events touch many different parts of the organization. And so whether you're looking at compliance or risk independently, those are enterprise challenges. And therefore, you have to think of this in an enterprise manner. You have to think of how do we connect the dots. And it's evident as organizations tackle risk and compliance that they have to get multiple functions moving in the right direction. And I always like to say risk management is a team sport. The functions have to work together. So first thing I want to ground this discussion is that as an enterprise challenge, risk management touches all parts of the organization. All risks are in some way connected, but we also have to think of risk as both an opportunity and an obstacle. Some risks can be avoided. Some risks actually need to be exploited, or you take on risk. And in fact, risk is something that the entire organization should be aware of within the culture. The second part of that statement is then the entire organization needs to be involved in identifying the risks, assessing their importance and the impact of potential events, and determining what needs to happen to mitigate, avoid, or transfer, or even accept risk. So when we think of that, the challenge gets a little bit even more difficult when we think about trying to break down the silos. Getting risk management is difficult, and that's not just a statement, it's the reality. There are a lot of different compounding factors that make effective risk management a real challenge. You have the data proliferation in silos. So even if you're gathering good risk data or compliance data, a lot of times it's in separate buckets. And it's across the organization, and it's really hard to consolidate and then analyze and then act on. And many times manual processes get in the way. Unfortunately, still a lot of manual processes dominate the workflows around risk and compliance. And those are time consuming, they're error prone, and they ultimately slow down decision making where speed and agility today are really critical. Then, those manual processes lead to out-of-date reporting by the time the data is gathered from those different silos, and it's workflowed through a manual process. And now you're presenting it, to make a decision. It could be out of date, and that really makes leadership blind to what's happening now, which is really what they need to make a decision rather than potentially reacting to yesterday's problems. A couple other things that I want to point out too is across risk management, there's a lot of subjectivity and inconsistency. And the root of that issue is the different scales and the different approaches used with across methodologies and assessments, especially when you're using qualitative terms like high, medium, low. All of those are relative terms. Or even if you've taken the next step and defined different types of ranges for different types of risk or impacts, it still leads to a lot of subjectivity. Now, all of this is happening in an era that we have limited budgets and resources. The threats are constantly changing. Regulatory drivers and things like emerging sustainability expectations are all moving at a fast clip. And so keeping up with that is really difficult. And getting it wrong costs. And these are just some, random factoids to kind of draw your attention to a few of the different types of impacts in getting risk and compliance wrong. First, you have the regulatory landscape and regulatory bodies delivering fines and penalties. That is a hit to the bottom line. It is one of the first things that organizations think of when it comes to regulatory compliance is what are the fines and violations. But in addition to if you are subject to a violation or a fine, you're still spending a lot of time and money and resources on compliance. An example, financial institutions last year spent an estimated $181 billion just maintaining financial compliance around financial reporting and so forth. So a lot of time and effort go into it. And then if something does happen and if there's a disruption by all kinds of different factors, it could be, a physical disaster. It could be a cyber attack. It could be an error or downtime from a human error. So when it does happen, it does cost companies significant time and money. And this is just a study that Reuters took, that it was the average annual loss per company due to these types of disruptions was $82 million. So getting it right is difficult. Getting it wrong costs. But getting it right does pay off. And these are just some statistics taken out of a survey that PwC performed. And the point of these two data points is that when you are confident in your risk management, the business has the ability to balance the growth and risk. The organization feels that they could maybe potentially take on some more risk to create opportunities. And so there's this level of confidence that goes beyond just checking the box of, yes, we are complying with our regulatory requirements, or yes, we are performing our risk management duties on a regular basis. If you build that confidence, it pays off. And to do that, or to build that confidence, you really have to help the business make better decisions. And you have to deliver the confidence that risk management is surfacing up the issues that can truly disrupt the organization. But we also often think of risk management as a way to flag problems, high risks, medium risks, or red, amber, green, whatever the labels are, to just flag these types of risks. But the real value of risk management goes beyond labeling the risks. It's enabling the decisions around those risks. And so with good risk management, you don't just protect value, you help create it. You answer tough strategic questions. And these questions are often overlooked in the day-to-day operations, especially when the risk and compliance teams are really fighting upstream. If they have data proliferation in silos, manual processes, those types of things that get in the way. And so if you can answer questions like, what are we missing in trends and outliers? What are some of the trends that might be hidden in the data that we don't readily have visibility into? Or what types of strategic projects can we take on that might reduce risk, that might free up capital because we're more or we're optimizing our control approach? Being able to shift investment towards opportunities and away from high cost activities like manual risk assessments and manual compliance assessments. So I want to talk about the yin and yang of risk and compliance management. You have the compliance burden, which is the ongoing onslaught of regulatory change. And then you have the risk conundrum. I like using the word conundrum because it's something that that you should be able to solve, but it's not easy to really get it right. But on the yin side, the compliance represents the gravity of constant change and scrutiny. So regulations constantly are changing, and every update, whether it's a regulation or a deregulation, brings fresh requirements. It requires new audits. It involves different reporting obligations. And so to really meet this, you have to meet compliance with discipline and persistence. On the yang side, risk management should actually be a more proactive response to uncertainty. It shouldn't be looking in the rear view mirror and saying, this is what did happen. It should be looking at those unknown threats, whether it's cyber attacks or market shifts or operational failures, and helping anticipate the outcomes. And a key point of this is really understanding the exposure related to those risks. And that helps steer us towards the goals. So if you think about it, compliance keeps us on the right side of the rules, and risk management empowers us to seize those opportunities with confidence. And we want to bring these two worlds together and really balance out the vigilance that compliance brings us with the forward momentum of risk. And that's how you build an organization that is resilient and agile. So let's talk about these two major life cycles. The first, on the regulatory side, is how do you deal with the constant pull or push of regulatory change? And so the life cycle is pretty straightforward. I don't want to say it's linear because it does require iteration. It does require talking with the business and so forth. But on the first part of identifying your regulatory landscape, a few recommendations. First is clearly defining your scope of regulatory coverage and understanding that from a geographical perspective, your industry, and even down to the individual products and services. This helps you understand what are the regulatory bodies I need to monitor, where do I get the right information, and how do I cut down at as much noise as possible and really focus on what affects my business. As part of that, you have to operationalize the ongoing monitoring of regulatory sources, because these regulatory bodies issue guidance, they issue memorandums, they publish papers that may be commenting on existing letter of the law, or they may be indicating where future direction is. You have to really look at that on an ongoing basis, not as as just a one-time type of activity. And then you have to also look at covering all of the bases. It's not just the laws or the regulations and those documents. It is also the things that go around it. It's the enforcement actions. How active is the regulatory body in enforcing, and what are the types of actions that are coming out of it? What are the news or the proposed changes, advisory memos, and those other things that give you an indicators of where the regulatory landscape is headed? The second piece is out of those processes, you have to synthesize and create a clear understanding of what your obligations are. So building an obligations catalog that consolidates, clarifies, and structures those obligations, especially when it comes from regulatory bodies. And then the next step is looking at those obligations and internalizing those for the organization into the form of policies and controls. How are we documenting our approach to meet these obligations? Now, once you've done that, you're not done. It's basically an ongoing work to identify gaps, conflicts, resolving issues, and maintaining that alignment between obligations and controls. In many organizations, they'll see conflicts at the obligation level, where you have one jurisdiction that says you have to do something or respond by something by 45 days. You have another jurisdiction that says 60 days, another jurisdiction that says 180 days. And you have to make the decisions of how do we deal with those conflicts? Do we just require everybody to the most stringent, or can we implement controls that give that leeway between those types of, for example, jurisdictional differences? Now, you're not done, because you're going to have to push those controls down into audit and compliance processes to ensure that they're operating effectively, that they're designed effectively, and really create this life cycle approach of, as controls are failing, how are they aligned with our obligations? How are we reporting those control failures, and how are we moving through the mitigation steps? Now, good news is there's a lot of work that is being done to help automate this, and this is one of the areas that I mentioned right at the start that sits in the way of progress is doing a lot of this stuff manually. I first started my career in GRC and doing a lot of control mapping and looking at different regulations and other authoritative sources and mapping those obligations to existing policies and so forth. Very tedious, very subjective, not a lot of science behind it other than the experience of the individuals doing this. Well, AI is providing us with many capabilities to do things like monitoring regulatory sources, or consolidating and bringing in line all of the obligations, the controls, and identifying the gaps and conflicts. So these are areas that are being pushed on the AI front, specific to compliance management. And a few things that we've learned at Archer as we've been implementing these technologies that is very helpful in understanding is that AI can be a great help if you have, in this space, well-defined controls, well-written policies, strong control libraries that are consistent, that have the right elements of controls and so forth. And that's not always the case within organizations. A lot of control libraries are built very organically. And so there's duplicative controls being documented, or a wide variation in the nature of the controls, or inconsistencies are how they're documented. Are you properly defining the control, defining who does it, when they do it, how they do it, and providing the guidance needed to meet those obligations? Now, I want to ask a quick question, because we're going to set this up for a conversation, is if your organization understands the cost of their controls. And so if your organization goes through the process, when you document a control, do you actually estimate the cost of that control? You do it inconsistently. And Answer C is no, but I would love to be able to do this as part of our process. And D is no, we're not going to go about this. So I'd like to take a moment or two, if you can answer the questions, just to give some feedback, because I want to talk about this in a little bit. And we'll just give a few moments for people to submit their answers. The reason I'm asking this is that this is a key element that we are evangelizing as a way to get your arms around the true impact of compliance and risk. First, you have to understand the impact on the organization. And as you're designing controls, ideally, you're not just documenting the control, but then you're looking at what does this control take in terms of time, resources, tooling, equipment, other types of things that go into the cost of the control. So we'll give like a minute or 30 more seconds. If you haven't submitted, please submit. Would love to see your thoughts about this. And I think we'll go ahead and for time purposes, we'll go on to the next. Okay, great. So I love the fact that there was 0 answers on no, we have no plans for this. I think the fact that we have almost 20% doing that on a consistent basis is great. And I'm going to talk about what the benefits of that are as we go forward. So thank you for your inputs on that. The next life cycle I want to talk about is that risk management life cycle, which is really about dealing with the business risk, so non-regulatory types of impacts, and how you go about identifying and resolving those risks. So let's look at that process. The first point around developing well-written standard risk statements for business entities is a point I can't emphasize enough. One of the things that I mentioned before is the inconsistency in control libraries is because a lot of times that process is very organic. It's given off to perhaps the business to document your controls, and depending on the level of guidance, that control library, the output of that, which is really a foundation of what the organization is doing, can vary widely. Same thing on the risk side. It's very important to standardize the taxonomy and the language around risk, so that when when the business is describing that risk and looking at what the impact is, that you have some consistency across your different business entities, whether you're documenting risks at a business unit level or a business process level or at some other entity level. Having some consistency allows those business units to really understand the risks that they're talking about. The second area that I really want to emphasize is the transition to a quantitative-based assessment. Many organizations still do qualitative assessments. And the basic conversation is, what is the likelihood that this risk will happen? And if this risk or the event happens, what is the impact? The traditional likelihood times impact type of discussion. When you describe both likelihood and impact in qualitative terms, whether it's high, medium, low, whether it's red, yellow, green, whether it is within ranges, and saying an impact could be anywhere from $100,000 to $500,000, for example. One, you're providing a lot of subjectivity in some cases. The other thing is you're giving some pretty broad ranges. And the ultimate output of this is the traditional heat map, whether it's the 3x3 or a 5x5 risk matrix, that helps you really kind of label some risks. It helps you bucket them into broad categories. It starts the conversation. But what it doesn't do is differentiate risks. What is different about the same risks that end up in the same bucket in a 5x5 matrix? It also doesn't allow you to aggregate. You can say, you can count risks. I have 3 oranges, 2 yellows, 4 green, but I really don't know what the aggregated impact or the aggregated exposure is. So moving to a quantitative based assessment is really the next step within the risk management methodologies. Next, to help support that quantitative approach and to really get visibility into what's going on the operations side, you have to gather the risk data. So executing risk assessments on a periodic basis to just review those risks. Whether this is a traditional risk and control self-assessment, whether these are more targeted risk assessments, it's all about just gathering signals from your organization about the things that are happening within your operations. Defining and tracking expected metrics. So the key risk indicators that we traditionally document and then gather. And then another key data point that helps support this process is looking at incidents, losses, insurance claims, whatever those output of when something actually happens. During the treat risk period, one of the key parts of this is monitoring the controls and tying that into the audit and compliance processes that would be part of that regulatory life cycle that I just talked about. Anytime you look at a control and test it, it should be feeding multiple views. It should be answering the compliance question. Based upon my regulatory obligation, I've implemented this control. This control is designed and operating effectively, therefore I am meeting that obligation. But it should also answer the question of, are we managing the risk associated with that control effectively as well? So this is a crossover, if you will, where both regulatory management, regulatory compliance, and risk management meet. Evaluating new risks is another excellent area to take a look at. How you're categorizing, mapping, aggregating, reporting on those losses, looking for systemic issues, looking for outliers, looking for trends, looking for the anomalies that may indicate a certain type of issue. And this isn't just looking isolated at incident by incident by incident. It's looking at the aggregation of potential losses, or looking at incident trends. Is there something causing an incident type to go up within a particular business unit, or move faster at a higher rate than other parts of the organization that are very similar? Those help you identify maybe some of the systemic issues that you want to then identify and escalate up to the business leadership, who can then take a step back and say, okay, based upon the signals that I've seen, are we aligned with our tolerance and appetite? And again, going back to the quantitative based assessments, you have to ask, what is your tolerance when you're talking about things in high, medium, and low, or bucketing things into broad ranges? And so this is another area where having the same conversation about likelihood and impact, but using more quantitative approaches to create the output helps. Now, I'm going to also point out there's some very interesting areas of AI that are happening in these particular areas as well. The first is development of risk statements, because the language of risk can vary when you kind of put it on the shoulders of the business. You can use AI to make sure that you're writing well-constructed risk statements. Analytics in the risk data is another important piece that AI can play a really good piece or provide some capabilities to help identify those outliers, trends, do systemic analytics to identify issues. So I'm going to ask another poll question. I ask, please answer this. This is on the quantitative-based risk assessments. And when I say quantitative-based, I'm meaning more of using probabilities and loss curves and those types of inputs. Now, one of the so is it your normal mode of operation? Is it you're doing it for only key risks? No, but you would like to move into that direction, and no, you don't have any plans to do this. And the reason that we're looking to move in this direction is not necessarily change the conversation that you're having with the business. You still want to talk to the business about what is the likelihood that this type of event it would happen. But instead of expressing that likelihood in a subjective label or a wide range of guesses, you're really asking them to be more a little more precise, but giving them the ability to say, this is what the probability is that this event would happen in the next 12 months, for example. On the impact side, a lot of people use scoring methods, which is valid for certain types of risks. But ultimately, we want to get to the point where we can actually have the dollars and cents conversation. What is the actual exposure from a financial perspective? Now, you are going to still have the non-economic consequences of risks. You're still going to have, the intangibles, if you will. Reputational damage or health and safety may not be directly related to economic consequences. But being able to express that in a quantitative term is much easier to have some business decisions. So great. Another 0% on the no, we have no plan. So that's great. For those that are using quantitative-based assessments as your normal mode of operation, that is great. Good for you, because that really helps you. Hopefully you're finding that helps with your business decisions. And I think this is just like I said, the normal graduation, if you will, to the next level of risk assessment methodologies. I think we have the tools, we have the experience to take the outputs of risk assessments off to the next level. So let's go back to our yin and yang. So on the regulatory compliance side, we're creating the assurance that your control environment will meet regulatory requirements and additionally manage the risks related to regulatory risks. So it's really answering the questions, what should we be doing and are we doing it well? On the risk management side, through all of those steps, you're helping prioritize your efforts and delivering the right insights to make risk-informed decisions. So what should we be concerned about? Where can we improve? And this is where I want to take the next step a little bit closer to the two topics that I talked about in the poll questions, is the control estimates of costs and the quantitative-based assessments. So a little bit of a busy diagram, but let's walk through this. If we basically know risks and controls are mapped together, you have a control owner, that's the person responsible for the implementing the control. You have a risk manager, risk second line of defense, that they're looking at how does this risk affect the business. Now, they both could be in the business as well. They could be second line, first line, depending on your organization, how you split this up. But in essence, you define a control, and in the compliance process, in that life cycle, you assess that control, you determine whether it's compliant or not, you generate findings, you close out those findings, you ensure that your controls are designed and operating effectively. If you are then asking the control owner, how much does it take to implement individual controls? And again, this could be a blend of software licensing, time and resources, consulting fees, whatever the control is, managed services costs, whatever it is, you can start aggregating the cost of the controls and understanding what is the cost of the effort. Now, this does give you insights in of itself. It allows you to then look at, on the regulatory side, if I have my obligations and I understand what controls I have in place to meet that, now I'm getting some sense of the level of effort and the costs associated with complying with regulations. But a major benefit comes when you, on the risk side, start looking at different types of risk events and quantifying the impact of those risk events. And you may have different types of assessment types, but ultimately we want to get to the point where we understand if this type of event happens, this is what our exposure is. Now, because controls and risks are mapped together, this provides you with the ability to then aggregate your loss exposure and then ultimately look at that, look at the two sides of the coin. What are we spending on controls and what is the aggregated loss exposure? And I think this is one of the other major incentives of going towards a more quantitative output from your risk management process so that you can make some good decisions. Are you spending too much to offset this exposure? Are you not spending enough? In a qualitative world, you could do this and say, well, we're spending $1 million to help manage an orange risk or a risk that's sitting on this 5x5 in this box. Okay, you understand kind of where it sits, but that's really not enough information to make a business decision. And so if you're on the quantitative side of risk management, then you're able to express exposure in terms the business can determine, yes, that's beyond our tolerance. We're exposing ourselves to a potential high level of risk. We are spending this amount of money to get to that level of exposure. Perhaps we need to invest more in controls to bring that exposure down. Conversely, you may say we're spending too much because our exposure is well below our tolerance. And therefore, let's shift some money. Let's go look at where controls might be reduced, brought back on some spending, make some adjustments to then shift some of that, those resources over to drive opportunities. So really, two major outputs out of our yin and yang are how much am I spending on the control side and how much am I exposed on the loss side or on the risk side. And that helps really bring together these two worlds so that the functions that are managing risk and compliance are now talking together. They're comparing costs and looking at controls, they're looking at risk, and then deciding what is the best direction for the organization. And so when you look at this kind of integrated approach across all of these functions, there's three things to really think about how to enable this. The first is getting the processes aligned with the business. You want regulatory and risk management processes not to be something off to the side or something that's just another administrative burden on the business. You want those processes just aligned with how the business operates on a day-to-day basis. You have to look at where you're getting the right data to get that view into risks and issues in the business. So how are you executing your audits and your compliance assessments? How are you looking at that data on the regulatory side? How are you communicating requirements and obligations to the business? And then on the risk management side, how are you gathering the right risk data through assessments, through monitoring incidents and losses, and other data points that help you build that view of your potential exposure. And then finally, you have to go back to, I'm not doing risk and compliance just to do risk and compliance. Yes, I have to meet regulatory requirements and avoid regulatory fines, violations, all of that. That's what you have to do within your business. But at the end of the day, both risk and compliance functions should be helping the business make better business decisions. And a lot of this will come down to, are we achieving the results that we want with the effort that makes the most sense? It's not about acting everywhere. It's acting with purpose, with the right intensity, at the right time. So I want to leave you with three thoughts for you to take away, and then we'll open up for questions. Again, you can submit your questions through the Q&A, and we have some time for some questions. So, but I want to leave you with a couple final thoughts. For those of you who are that are estimating your cost of controls on a regular basis, you're meeting this. But for those of you that aren't, investigate how you can start putting that into your normal mode of documenting controls, having the conversation with the business to really understand what is the level of effort. When we ask you to implement this control, what is it actually going to take? And putting that as part of the standard documentation around a control. You obviously still want the who, what, where, why, how of a control, but now adding how much to that list will help you get a sense, both on the regulatory side, how much we're spending to meet these obligations, and on the risk side, how much are we effort are we expending to mitigate risk. The second, again, for those of you who are doing quantitative assessments, hats off to you, because that is a big step of adding value to your risk management processes. But for those of you who are still doing qualitative-based assessments, think about how you can move towards a more quantitative approach. And again, I'm not asking you to go and hire a bunch of statisticians and mathematicians and doing a lot of intense analytics and looking a lot of past data and so forth. Most of the concerns that I hear about moving towards a quantitative-based assessments is we don't have the skills, we don't have the data, we don't feel comfortable using numbers. But if you're comfortable giving very subjective labels or wide ranges of impacts, then what this does is just take it a little step further. You're having the same conversation. What is the likelihood of this event happening? But don't express it in labels, express it in the terms of probability or frequency of this type of event. And if you don't have the data to identify the specific frequency, then base it on your existing qualitative approach. If you said medium, what does the business think is a medium probability? Is it happen once every 5 years, once every 2 years, once every year, once a month? What is that? And then convert that into a frequency of event. On the impact side, again, if you're using ranges, medium is 100,000 to 500,000. You can start as a basis for things like loss curves to then start looking at exposure from a quantitative or economic perspective. And then finally, the last point is make sure you're asking the business what decisions they need help with. And looking at this as an opportunity to learn more about the business, go back and find out what is the data that I need, what are the things that I need to assess to understand how that business can make a better decision. And again, all of this should be rooted in the fact that we want to help them make a good decision. And so find out what those decisions are that they're wanting to make. Is it, I'm spending too much on controls, which control could I maybe ratchet back on, or my risk is beyond my tolerance. What are the high impact areas? What are the types of events that I should really focus on to bring risk back into a level of tolerance? So I'm gonna stop there. We have a few minutes for questions. Happy to answer any questions, and if you submit them in the Q&A, I'll take them. We had a couple of them come in, and I'm just going to start with one of them, but feel free to submit your own questions. The first question is, how can organizations shift their perception of risk management from a defensive necessity to a strategic enabler of growth and innovation? I think that's a great question, because that really shows that you're interested in getting beyond the check the box, or the kind of zombie motion that sometimes compliance and risk management processes can fall into. It's, yes, we do a RCSA every year. We're going to go through this process. The business hates us for it, and we'll see you next year after we do that. That's really something that enforces in the business the perception that this is just a necessity that I have to do. I think if you start the conversation with, we're interested in how your business has changed, what are your operations like today, what are you worried about, and work your way back to the decisions that they want to make, then you can emphasize that you're there to help with growth and innovation. The next question that came in, I love that you played off my yin and yang. So how can organizations effectively balance the yin of compliance with the yang of risk management to build resilience and agility? I think just like yin and yang, like they're equal, but and connected, but they're different. I think building a strategy that pushes both of them forward is necessary. You don't want one to really get too far out in front of the other. If you have really mature compliance processes, then take a look at what can risk management learn from that maturity to help push risk management processes ahead. Compliance programs many times are pretty good at like executing things on a regular basis, building out things like audit plans and so forth. Well, how can risk management leverage that? Or on the flip side, you have some mature risk processes. What can compliance learn from that? I think the other thing is also remember that these are two sides of the same coin. So they should feed each other. As I said before, when you assess the control, it should not just answer a question for one small regulatory scope. It should help inform other parts of your overall program. Okay, the next question. I want to set up a business in a dynamic industry, but cannot exactly determine what are the risks, exposures, what do I need to do? Already identify what needs to be done, but still not feel confident. That's a great question. It's really where, kind of the starting point, especially if you're in a dynamic industry that has a good flow, if you will, of regulatory requirements, or is seeing a lot of shifts in the market or the industries. I think you as someone famously said, you start at the beginning. So you do have to look at some of the common frameworks that help identify some of the core operational business risks that you need to be assessing and looking at. So common disruptions on the operational side, the basic regulatory requirements and sources, and the obligations within your industry, and you start working your way forward. I think when you look at it, that both sides of both risk and compliance can be fueled by at the same time. So again, a regulatory obligation represents in some fashion a risk, meaning that regulatory obligation is probably in place because some event happened at some time that drove it to be put in place. That was probably an unmanaged risk. On the flip side, those risks really, unmanaged risks many times unfortunately become regulatory obligations because something happens, and it happens enough that the industry or the government or whoever's setting the regulatory requirements steps in to help bring it back in line. So I think looking at the processes and building out the fundamentals, thinking through that life cycle, those life cycles that I showed. How do you identify your regulatory landscape, understand your obligations, align your controls, and then monitor compliance and audit from a regulatory side? And how do you identify the risks? Again, you can start with some of the basics and then move forward, but identify those risks, looking at the exposure, how are you treating those risks, gathering the right data, and then kind of more on the proactive side is then taking a look at what has happened within the operations that might identify some of your more systemic issues. And I'm going to take one last question and then we'll have to wrap it up. Let's see, what would be a good question? How can organizations quantify the ROI of their control environment and use that data to drive smarter investments in risk mitigation? I think the first step, as I said, is understanding how much you're spending on the controls themselves. Then you have a baseline. As you understand the role that control plays in your risk mitigation strategy. So if I have a control that is mapped to multiple types of risk events, for example, the improvement of that control affects those different types of events. So it's looking at those common controls that affect multiple types of risks that are the smart investment. So if I have a control that is a preventive in nature, it helps prevent multiple types of risk events, and I improve that control to reduce perhaps the frequency of these different types of events, I am now, if you will, killing multiple birds with one stone. So that's a smart investment. Now, there may be some controls that you have to invest in that are absolutes. You have to do them because of, for example, a regulatory obligation. Those are controls that you know that you have to execute on. But on the flip side, there might be some controls that are providing you a low impact. Like the ROI, the spend on it is not really affecting the number or the types of risk events that we want to, that we feel like we have some leeway on. So perhaps, again, running a scenario, what if we remove that control? What happens to the exposure of those risks? Does it skyrocket, or are there other controls that are helping mitigate those types of risk events that you can, reduce the amount of effort on that individual control? Hopefully that answers all of your questions. Thanks for submitting them. I'm going to turn it back and we'll wrap it up. Thank you, though, for your time today.
Awesome, Steve. Thank you. Thank you for your time as well, and for sharing your insights. And I think I can speak on behalf of everyone here when we say we'd look forward to continue these conversations, specifically at Risk Minds International this November in London as well. And as a thank you for our listeners today, you can find an exclusive 10% offer for your ticket for Risk Minds in the resources widget as well. So Steve, once again, it's been a pleasure to be your host today, to you and everyone in the audience. If anyone has any feedback on today's webinar or any recommendations for the future, please fill out the short survey at the end of the webinar. Otherwise, follow us on LinkedIn. It's at Risk Minds for the latest insights on the community and updates on the upcoming event. So once again, thank you all for joining us and hope to see you again soon.
Thank you.